Have you ever caught a glimpse of movement right in the corner of your eye, only to turn and find an empty room? Or maybe you were looking at a shadow in the dark and you felt absolutely certain, just for a split second, that it was a person. You know, our perception feels totally flawless. It feels exactly like a perfect, high-definition camera feeding a live stream right into our minds. But, well, the actual science of vision tells a much darker, much more complex story.
What if your eyes are working perfectly, but your brain makes you see something that isn't really there? It's a pretty chilling thought, right? I mean, we rely on our senses to navigate reality, to keep us safe, to basically tell us what is true. But to truly understand human vision, we kind of have to challenge that fundamental trust. We need to look closely at the fragile, super intricate machinery inside our heads that bridges the gap between the physical world out there and our conscious experience of it in here.
Part 1. The Interpreted World. Okay, let's dive right into this. To understand how we can see things that aren't there, we first got to understand how we see things that actually are there. The baseline rule is this: the eyes collect visual information, but the brain interprets it. We usually think of seeing as this passive event, just absorbing the world. But the scientific reality? The world as it appears to you is the result of a highly active, really complex process of inference performed by your brain. Basically, think of your eyes as data gatherers. They're just collecting raw, physical, bottom-up data, literally just photons of light hitting your retina. But that data, it's noisy, it's often ambiguous, and it's totally meaningless on its own. It's entirely up to your brain to perform top-down processing. Your brain takes that raw data, analyzes it, and essentially makes an educated guess about what's actually out there.
Part 2. Influences on perception.
So let's see how this builds. If vision is really just the brain making an educated guess, what exactly influences that guess? Well, your internal state directly impacts what you see, especially when the visual information coming in is weak or ambiguous. We're talking about things like expectations, context, attention, and your previous experience. Researchers have found that both our stable states, our prior knowledge and long-term conditioning, and our transient states, like what we just happen to be paying attention to in a given moment, they drastically alter perception. Think about it. If you're actively expecting to see a threat, your brain is absolutely primed to interpret a totally harmless, ambiguous shadow as a threat. Your brain is actively guiding its interpretation of the visual data based on what it already knows and feels.
And this naturally brings us to a phenomenon we've literally all experienced at some point. An optical illusion is simply a scenario where the brain interprets a real external visual stimulus incorrectly. During an illusion, your brain is actually doing its job. It's actively trying to make sense of complex or ambiguous real-world data, but the specific patterns trick the brain's top-down processing into making the wrong inference. So you see motion where there absolutely isn't any, or maybe a curve where there's just a straight line. The data is real, it's there, but the brain's conclusion is just a total mismatch.
Part 3. Illusions versus hallucinations.
Now, an optical illusion relies on a physical object actually being there in the first place. But what happens when the human perceptual system crosses a critical threshold into something entirely different? We really have to draw a hard line between these two phenomena. An optical illusion means a real stimulus is interpreted incorrectly, but a visual hallucination is fundamentally different. This is when a visual experience occurs completely without a matching external stimulus. There's no ambiguous shadow. There's no tricky pattern of lines. The eyes are not collecting data that matches the experience, and yet the viewer perceives a vivid, complex visual event. So the big question is, how does a seemingly healthy or even an impaired brain generate a visual output with literally zero physical input?
The science here is absolutely fascinating. And it's really important to clarify something right off the bat. Perception is not governed by any single isolated brain region. There's no one single hallucination switch or anything like that in the brain. Instead, visual hallucinations are deeply tied to disrupted functional connectivity networks. Recent research into psychiatric, neurologic, and ophthalmologic conditions reveals that when the intricate communication networks across different areas of the brain break down, hallucinations can happen. This can actually be driven by underlying biochemical dysfunctions, such as a decrease in cholinergic activity, which fundamentally alters how higher-order visual processing areas interact with the rest of the brain. Simply put, when the network gets out of sync, the brain can start processing its own internal signals as if they were actual external realities.
Part 4. The scientific debate. Now, you might assume that with all our modern neuroimaging, scientists have mapped out exactly why this happens, right? But the truth is, despite decades of intense research, experts still do not definitively know the exact mechanisms. In fact, since the year 2000 alone, researchers have published 8 entirely different theoretical models attempting to explain complex visual hallucinations. 8!
These proposed models include things like deafferentiation, which is the idea that a lack of visual input causes the brain to essentially fill the void with its own images. Then there's reality monitoring, the perception and attention deficit model, and active inference. Each of these models stems from completely different understandings of how the brain is organized. Today, top researchers from around the world are working hard to synthesize these models into one integrated visual hallucination framework. They're trying to harmonize the evidence to figure out exactly why the brain sometimes acts as its own projector. But let me tell you, the debate is fierce, and the science is very much still evolving.
So, what does all of this research, all of these models, and all of these visual networks actually tell us? Well, it points to a profound truth about human existence. Every shadow, every face, every sudden flash of light you see is a delicate, intricate calculation happening in real time. Our perception isn't just a passive window into reality. It's an active, vulnerable, and brilliantly complex construction. It really makes you wonder, what else might your mind be inventing right now? You don't simply see the world with your eyes.
Your brain interprets it.